Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Freedom Factor. I wanted to discuss this. I've been wanting to discuss this for a while, and I couldn't find the right kind of way to broach it. So we're gonna kind of get into it. This is basically how the kind of the relationship between anarchism and libertarianism, and we have to, and how I see a lot of people kind of try and make the case that libertarianism, the end goal is usually anarchism, and it's not a universal ideology. Within the sphere of libertarianism, yes, there are a lot of people who tend to favor anarchism, and a lot of people who tend to say, well, some statist policy is necessary. And so I wanted to delve into that and kind of give my thoughts and kind of give a kind of broad overview. Now, granted, this is not going to be as deep of a dive, and I'm not an expert. Um, I would say if you want to find some good resources explaining anarchism, Michael Malice is a wonderful resource. He has a much broader and deeper understanding of anarchism than I think most. And there are some points I agree with him on, and there are some I disagree with him on. However, this is not meant to be a critique saying that anarchism is bad. There are aspects of anarchism that are good, and there are aspects that are bad. And I will preface this by saying, in terms of a broader, having kind of an anarchist society in a larger scale, such as that of a nation, which calling it a nation, being anarchist, is kind of contradictory. But at any rate, within an established territory, at a large scale, I do view anarchism as being essentially everything but impossible. Not probable is kind of more of an accurate descriptor. So we need to get our terms kind of under control here and kind of basically define things. So first of all, anarchism is, and this is going to be very oversimplified terminology, but anarchism is essentially a voluntary society absent a centralized government. It's kind of a collaborative and voluntary structuring of society, which government basically is. Any political theory is basically how we organize and structure ourselves within society. Now, there are some that will say we really haven't had organized states except for the last about 5,000 years. To a degree, yes. However, I would say that we've had there's been organization and hierarchy throughout the years, and ancient civilizations. We can delve into that, but to give kind of a broad strokes, that they say there are proponents who say that anarchism existed for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years prior to officially recognizing the nation state. Now, I will say libertarianism is a little bit more difficult to define. And so the best way to really kind of broadly do it, there's a bunch of different uh, definitional sources, I guess. Kind of there's the Lockean view. So basically, what libertarianism really is the political, and this is from Britannica. What they're saying, political philosophy that takes individual liberty to be the primary political value. Kind of classic liberalism. Basically, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, and even Thomas Jefferson would be classified as kind of libertarian thinkers. It's basically that it organizes government in terms of natural or God-given individual rights, the right to life, liberty, property, freedom, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and then government of the people by consent. And it basically, in classical liberalism, it is, a limited government that protects the rights of the people, and serves the people. And really, it's kind of, it recognizes people such as, Locke and Jefferson recognize that the state is a necessary evil. And really that kind of speaks to the heart of libertarianism, is that the state is, to an extent, and granted libertarianism is one of the few American political ideologies that is advocating for the most limited form of government possible, because it recognizes that it is a necessary thing, but it also is not a net benefit. That there are, given enough time that the government is in existence, it eventually will erode freedom, and that keeping it limited is absolutely necessary. However, as we've seen with pretty much all modern, I would say all modern first world governments, that they have kind of strayed away from a limited factor and have extended themselves into these great big powers. And again, going back to Michael Malice, he explains it perfectly that it's a monopoly. There, in your given jurisdiction, there's one law, there's one police, there's one, essentially one governing factor, and that's it. There's no alternative. It is a monopoly. Like if I were to call 911 right now, the city police would show up. Now, granted, there are also county, that the county does have limited jurisdiction, but within the municipality of a city, that police force is the de facto law enforcement. That is the monopolizing, I guess, the monopoly on violence that exists within that jurisdiction. And that's kind of where we've drawn lines. And throughout history, we've done this kind of idea of drawing lines. This territory is my territory, this territory is your territory. And it's expanded. It's gone from the individual in a anarchist society, absent a state, and this is going back thousands of years. My family or my tribe occupies this area, this is our territory, and another territory. So you can have that, but on a larger scale, when nation states began to emerge, that's where you've kind of gotten into this hierarchy of things. So to understand that, you also have to understand the various forms of which governance works. Monarchies, and there are various forms of organizational governments beyond a monarchy. There's such as like a parliamentary system, which is kind of sort of what America is, but really America is more of a representative republic that uses kind of a three branch that's kind of unique. Not a lot of countries at the time of America's founding were kind of organized in that fashion, where you have an executive head, a legislative body, and a judicial body that were all intended to be equal. Now, there's a big debate on if that is still true today, especially with the idea of executive order and legislation from the court bench that we see a lot, where basically courts can decide what extent legislative power extends over executive, or what extent the executive has over its own body. If, say, the CEO of a company says, I want to fire these these 5 people because I think that they're bad workers, and then a court comes in and says, no, you can't do that. That's like saying you have this power, but we're not going to give it to you. And that's kind of essentially if they're supposed to be equal, then you really can't have one overriding another within the bounds of its own decision-making process, within the bounds of its own powers. But I digress. So what essentially really to kind of give an overview of this, you have to look at the different forms. So libertarianism, there's, the left-leaning libertarianism kind of goes for more socialist kind of slant on things, which I find kind of interesting and almost contradictory, because I don't see how socialism and libertarianism can occupy the same sphere at the same time, because socialism is basically state-owned means of production where individual liberty and individual property rights are not held paramount. Whereas right libertarianism kind of is like, a good example would be anarcho-capitalism. And I'm, again, not an expert, but to kind of explain in a very broad, oversimplified term, anarcho-capitalism is basically capitalism without government. It's a capitalistic economic theory without government control, meaning it's what America could be if we eliminated the Fed and stopped letting the government dictate monetary policy. And that's kind of like the really broad stroke that I'm not even going to delve deep into it, but anarcho-capitalism is capitalism without state control. The market would dictate how the economy works. Price, there would be no such thing as government price controls, and it ideally would be self-regulating, where the industry of that particular industry would regulate itself. A good example of this is a lot of people, harp on, they think anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism cannot exist in a peaceful society because of malice, because of negligence, or because of ignorance, or something of that nature. For example, the best example I've ever heard is the restaurant. You have a set number of restaurants and in a given territory, and if one of these restaurants doesn't cook their chicken all the way through and people get sick, what controls are there to prevent harm? And government is necessary to create regulations to do that. Well, in essence, in an ideal world, the restaurant industry itself would regulate itself and say, hey, if you, and this is kind of a argument for anarchism, where without government, how would you enforce basically harm controls? And the restaurant is a good example where if you undercook your chicken and people are harmed by that, there needs to be recourse for that. If someone dies, then how do you decide punishment and things of that nature? And that's where people say, well, we need government to create regulations that stop that. Well, in essence, if a restaurant poisons its customers, nobody would go there. And therefore that restaurant would cease to exist. And all those people would be out of a job, and the owner would be out all of their money that they had initially invested into that business. And so that is the organization within an ideal society, that you don't need government to regulate that which causes harm, because if left to their own devices, people would work in their own self-interest, and harming their customers works against their self-interest. So, and granted, that's not the world we live in, because, negligence or cutting corners, people say everybody tries to save money, and so they're going to hire the least expensive cook they can, get the least the lowest quality ingredients and things of that nature for their business. When really to remain competitive, you get the best quality you can afford, and hopefully that quality translates to profit, and then you can get better. So the kind of socialist theory that we need government to control everything is just a misnomer. It's a non-starter that people don't understand that an actual free market society would organize itself in a way to reduce harm, because it doesn't work to the benefit to harm your customers, if that makes sense. Now, you get big enough, like Ford Motor Company, if they manufacture a car that, you know, if you hit the red line and the engine explodes and everybody inside dies, that's not a good thing. But they would continue that practice until they hit the threshold of a recall. So how do you prevent that? Well, you have the state comes in and basically says, we put in these controls that say you can't build a car that explodes when the engine redlines. This is just an absurd example, but it's kind of like showing that there needs to be some sort of control to that. Well, a free market society would say that no, if word got out that Ford built a car that exploded every time you hit the red line, no one would buy that car, and Ford would go out of business. And there would be lawsuits. Now, the courts is another area of where anarchism has some holes. But so to kind of understand things, there's also another aspect to anarchism. So it's said that socialism basically is downstream of communism, and I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me. In the most oversimplified, bare bones terminology, communism is basically socialism absent the state. And this is something that Marx, who I think was not a very good writer, having read Marx, and I don't think communism is a good idea. I don't think socialism is a good idea. I think they're both detrimental to the individual rights of people. And I hold individual rights almost higher than anything. Because individual liberty is the determining factor of moving forward towards the end goal of happiness and success and thriving. So a society cannot thrive without individual liberty. Now, Marx had clearly said that socialism is the transitional period between capitalism and communism. And essentially, socialism is the state owns the means of production. And the linchpin to all these political theories is private property. And a lot of people will say there's a difference between personal property and private property. However, the contents of your home is personal property, but the land in which you built your home is private property that you own. And other people will say, well, then the factory, that's private property owned by one person, but it benefits from the labor of the people who built the factory and the people who work at the factory. While true, yes, but that is a communist society or a socialist society would say that the people, everyone who contributes to the success of the factory should reap the benefits. In which case, the capitalist society says, well, no, that individual purchased the land with their money and paid for the workers to come and build the factory, and then they pay the workers to work the factory. So he put the investment in. They did not. Their labor is compensated by the owner through their pay, and that is a voluntary exchange. Socialism gets rid of that and says, no, the state owns this, and everybody who works works to the benefit of this, and everybody is equal. And then communism goes a step further and removes the state and says the people, the community, owns the factory, owns the property, and owns the labor because they all work there together. So the factory is in essence owned and operated by the workers, and they all equally share in the benefits. And that kind of, I mean, on paper, it potentially could work. And essentially, there's anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism. Anarcho-communism is essentially a redundant term because communism in its pure form is absent of state anyway. There is no state that runs things. Where you get into capitalism versus communism is that capitalism works towards, it involves private ownership. It emphasizes private property and private ownership of the means of production. Like my factory example, you own a factory, you paid for that factory, you get to reap the primary benefits, and it's a voluntary transaction between you and the customers if they buy your product that's built at that factory, and you and the workers that work the factory. You pay them what you feel is worth their labor. And that is essentially the capitalist model. Whereas communism, it really gets rid of the sole proprietor or the LLC, the company, the corporate entity that owns it, and it basically spreads that out among all the people. Well, the problem with communism is that if you have 100 people working at a factory, but really only about 30 people do the work, and the other 70 just kind of get by, they all share equally on that. And that basically you see those 30 people eventually go, well, these 70 people don't work as hard as us. Why should we work? And that brings down the quality. And that's where communism falls apart. So to break that, that down. So our terminology there kind of established what is anarchism? What essentially could it lead to? So anarchism, and really it's basically that, people, it's collectivism to a portion. And there can be capitalist means with which anarchism could work, where everybody, the one big problem with anarchism is it's an entirely voluntary organization of society. It means that everybody has to be on board for it to work. And there's been no large-scale anarchist society. There have been areas and some examples of successful, I guess you could say, successful examples of anarchisms, like the Revolutionary Catalonia in Spain in the 1930s. Basically, anarchists took control of Catalonia, and they kind of collectivized factories and farms, and everything was done. All the decisions were made through assemblies that were basically organized through direct democracy. So there's that, but it was eventually crushed by Franco in the Civil War. Then there's the Free Territory of Ukraine. This was kind of an anarcho-communism sort of thing. They basically organized land into local councils, and a militia was kind of organized. But eventually the Bolsheviks destroyed them. Then you have Zapatista Autonomous Municipalitarios in Mexico, where the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, basically it's a indigenous autonomous governance. They basically have their own schools, healthcare, and justice system. This was established in the 1990s. The problem is it's a very small area, and it kind of has some external economic and political issues, and so that kind of didn't really work out. I mean, it still is present today, but it's very small scale. And then there's the Rojava, northern Syria areas. This was like 2012. Basically, it's a direct democracy. They have local councils and kind of a socialized economy, but they're in an area that's very tumultuous. So a lot of them can be done on a small scale. I mean, you can have areas where anarchists, people say it's anarchism is like the oldest form of organizing, and while true, yes, it the pros of anarchism is it's completely voluntary society. It emphasizes the individual, and it allows for a cooperative kind of existence between two groups. So basically, anarchism relies more on its chief tenet is voluntarism, which is wonderful. In practice, it can be very successful in maintaining order and whatnot. However, where you get into some of the problems is you have to have a mutual recognition. What I mean by that is conflict arbitration has to be mutually agreed upon, where the rules have to be, you have to have guardrails in place to establish the rules. So in order to have success for an anarchist society, everyone needs to be on board. Everyone needs to be on board with the principles such as NAP, the non-aggression principle, where you will do no harm to another person without, absent justification. But basically, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Like everybody has to agree upon those, like these set rules that, hey, I'm not going to victimize somebody else. They're not going to victimize me, and we can all live happy together. Sounds great on paper. The problem is when humanity comes in. I gave some examples of some moderately successful, like Rojava and Zapatista. Those are examples of potentially successful. I mean, they're for the most part successful. But then you get the unsuccessful ones, and the prime example of that I always point to when discussing anarchism with people is Somalia. A lot of people, thanks to it becoming prevalent in the post 9/11 world and whatnot, is Black Hawk Down. Kind of put Somalia back into the spotlight and kind of made it more mainstream, that people understood what was going on there. But to really get into the broad strokes of why it's a good example of anarchism gone bad is that the government of Somalia collapsed. And in the ashes of the collapse of the government came to be this kind of warlord society. And basically, I mean, really it all centralized in Mogadishu, in essentially the late 80s and early 90s, where you had these warlords vying for control. And what they did was they enacted violence to exercise that control. And kind of as a result of the lack of order, people began to starve, and there was a famine. And the international community stepped in, namely the UN, and tried to distribute food. And the UN was being attacked by these militias, these warlords, that came in and took the food and used it as a coercive kind of means to control the people. So basically, it's you support my militia, or I'm not going to feed you. I'm not going to give you access to this food because we've used violence to exercise control over the food coming into the country. Well, then the UN kind of appealed and said, hey, our peacekeepers are having a hard time doing this. So then the United States Marine Corps stepped in. The Marines came in and basically said, nope, no more stealing of the food. We're stopping this right now. It's going to be distributed evenly. And that worked for a time until the Marines withdrew, and then it became coercive control, and then Operation Gothic Serpent happened. You know, the Army Rangers and Delta came in, tried to take out the top warlord, and following the events of October 3rd, Bill Clinton withdrew forces after 18 American soldiers were killed. And that kind of led to the return to anarchism, where the warlords took back control, and I would say it was kind of a failed, not really a failed operation, but basically a failed operation. And so Somalia was basically known as an anarchist state, where people were suffering. Refugees were fleeing the country en masse. That's where a lot of, over the last 30 years, America has seen a lot of influx of Somali refugees because of what has happened in that country. Why anarchism essentially showed its ugly failures. And that is where you get to the big difference between a successful anarchy and a unsuccessful anarchy, and why I believe that anarchism is not entirely possible on a large scale throughout a nation state, because like the United States could never have an anarchist society. It just never would happen. You have too many factions that would be butting heads, and it would splinter, and you would get basically a 5 or 6 part civil war, where you'd have one group of people and another group of people, people with competing interests and competing ideologies on how to live their lives, especially a 2-part capitalist versus communist society, because a lot of people would want to organize into one or the other camp, and then you'd have factions in there. And I just don't think it's possible for humans to peacefully coexist with competing ideas. And also you get into the problem of competing resources and things of that nature, which is why you can take aspects of anarchism and apply them to libertarianism, but you cannot have a wholly anarchist libertarian society, because you do have to recognize that at some point there needs to be some sort of guardrail. And I understand that proponents of anarchism will come in and disagree and say, but no, the state exercises a monopoly on violence, and that is antithetical to civil rights. And they always point to the example of police, which, being former law enforcement, I will not hide my bias here on this, but I do believe that a form of police is necessary, whether it's private or public. Really comes down to accountability. And is our current policing system perfect? Far from it. It needs a lot of improvements. Would a completely privatized model to replace it be preferable? Potentially. There are pros and cons. But in essence, a completely privatized society of anarchism, where people decide, okay, we want fire service, so we're going to pool our money together and pay for a fire service. That can work out great. Same thing with security. Have private security companies basically work as law enforcement to keep order, maintain order. It could work out potentially way better. However, you get into the pitfall of what happens when competing private companies decide that, well, your people wronged our people that employ us, and so we need conflict resolution kind of becomes too disjointed, and therefore it's not, you have to kind of have an agreed upon arbitration system. Whereas under an organized government where and I won't say America's perfect in this, especially with judicial corruption and the fact that we have given, one of my biggest complaints is we've given judges way too much power. And there's zero accountability. If a judge makes a wrong decision, it's potentially overturned on appeal, potentially, but there's no other consequences. That judge most of the time remains in power. And so that's where we get into that kind of problem. But that's not to say that a completely anarchist arbitration or court system would be preferred, because then you have these judicial bodies, these independent arbitration firms, so to speak, where they would be incapable of actually how there are too many unanswered questions. Like, how would justice be carried out? Would we have private prisons? Well, in which case then a private prison is paid based on inmates, and so they would have a financial incentive to imprison more people, because more people in prison, and that's what we're seeing with the private prison model in our current society here in America. So that is, I would say, essentially one of the biggest problems with regard to a fully privatized anarchist society, is you would need some sort of internally recognized form of arbitration and control for maintaining order. Otherwise, you'd have privatized chaos. The other problem of anarchism on a broad, large scale comes into play with regard to foreign I don't want to say entanglement, but foreign dealings. So with regard to international, cooperation, you also run into recognition of an anarchist state. That's where really a lot of problems come into play, where you run into issues of international trade, international recognition, and international aggression, where and a lot of people say, well, how come nobody invaded Somalia when they were an anarchist state? Well, it's because eventually, if left to a negative detrimental outcome, you have that the collapse into negative anarchism, kind of a warlord state. You have that problem of nobody wants to come in and attempt to take over a basically fractured society that's fighting amongst themselves for control and power, because then they're going to view you as the outside force. You'd have to be a lot stronger, and a lot of times it's not worth the effort, which is kind of why when America still had a functioning society to a degree during the Civil War, and a functioning military, but nobody came and invaded during the American Civil War. Also, there were the technological limiting factors at the time. Moving an entire army across an ocean. America is in a unique position that the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean barriers act as a kind of natural detriment to enemy invasion. However, you are seeing basically it would be the trade war that we're currently kind of seeing in America with Trump and the tariffs and all that would pale in comparison to basically a decentralized, privatized industry, unless they had, like America could be a unique experience for that, but that we're in that position where we can pretty much, we could, with international trade, have a kind of corporate trading partnership with other nations. That could work, but the lack of recognition, we couldn't really set a whole lot of guidelines that would be universally accepted in terms of unless there was cooperation. And that's, again, the issue. It comes back to the problem of anarchism, is it relies too heavily upon voluntary cooperation across the board. I mean, we're talking from down to the individual level, where I agree not to come and take your property, to my company agrees to not take over your company, we can trade freely amongst each other, to our private military agrees not to take over your private military, and things like that. And that also comes into kind of the double-edged sword of statism, that our society, the way it's structured, while not the most ideal, the best example we've seen of national defense is in fact our current model, where the centralized government runs the national defense, and it's put in the Constitution that that is one of their responsibilities. A private army is beholden to the dollar, as Machiavelli puts out, as Sun Tzu has said, that, your loyalties for a mercenary army are in their financial reward, not so much their loyalty to a country. Which is why, things like the French Foreign Legion are interesting, because they kind of demand of that you still have to follow orders and whatnot, and you are still at the behest of in the guidance of leadership. Whereas the privatization, in a lot of ways, works for a lot of things, but also doesn't work for everything. It's not a fix-all. And that broadly is the issue. I have yet to see a really compelling and viable solution of complete anarchism. Whereas I think a combination of very limited government libertarianism with anarcho-capitalism, in my personal opinion, and through the years and years of reading and research that I've done on this topic, because it's something that interests me, I have found that is a preferable outcome that we could strive toward, that would be the most broad-based beneficial for everybody. It would be extremely difficult to enact, especially in modern America, because of these monopolistic consequences that we've seen with our centralized government model, where the government has too much broad-based authority, too much fat, so to speak, where it would be very difficult, not impossible. Just like, enacting an anarchist society wouldn't be impossible. It just would be extremely difficult, almost so difficult to the point that it wouldn't even be worth it in the end, with how difficult it would be. Plus, because of our very segmented, fractured society, we also have the problem, and I'm basically going to broad stroke and kind of gloss over on this a little bit. I'm not going to get into it in depth. But also our modern quote-unquote melting pot of a society has made it very difficult to achieve something like an anarcho-capitalist libertarian society, as well as a pure anarchist society. So because you have so many competing interests, so many competing ideologies, so many competing mentalities, plus you have the additional issue of multiculturalism, which in some regard is good. Multiculturalism does expand your horizons and lets you learn about different ways of doing things, different methodologies, different cultural aspects. However, it does work as a detriment to the main cohesion of a state, where that is the biggest problem, that is the biggest barrier to a purely anarcho-capitalist libertarian society, or even an anarcho-capitalist anarchist society, where you have the people who want communism, you have the people who want government handouts, you have the people who are reliant upon the government, people who don't want to work. That was one of the things that came out of COVID that I think is the most egregious and terrifying revelation of American society, is this wide swath of anti-work people who flat out do not want to work. And then on top of that, and I plan on doing a video on this later, the demands for minimum wage, the whole concept of minimum wage is just absurd and atrocious. It completely defeats the purpose of a relationship, a free market, voluntary relationship between employer and employee, where basically it's saying, even if the work that you want done is only worth so much, you have to pay them this much. And this whole idea of a living wage. Well, if you want a living wage, I'll get into it at another time, but really essentially if you want a living wage, you have to work. You have to have the skills, the education, the experience, and the ethic to work, to deserve that, to earn that, because you really, in a truly voluntary, free market anarcho-capitalist society, you would be paid exactly what your worth is in the view of an employer, and and there would be a lot more competitiveness in that kind of society. But instead, we've allowed government control over so much, including the voluntary interaction between producers and employees, or between job creators and employers and employees. We've eroded that with government regulation and intervention into that. However, it is achievable at some point, and I think my personal opinion on this, and take it for what it's worth, my personal view on this is that the only way a truly anarcho-capitalist libertarian society or an anarcho-capitalist anarchist society is essentially, there would have in America, there would have to be a national divorce. There would have to be, it would have to create smaller independent nation states within the broader whole, such as like for example, like if it were allowed, if Texas were to secede and decide we want to be a limited government anarcho-capitalist society where the government does not control the economy, but instead the government exercises, let's just say law and order and national defense, and everything else is privatized, that would be possible. Be difficult, but it would be possible, as long as everybody who resides there would all agree to share in that experience. On the broader spectrum, though, you have too many competing interests in America to make anything like that actually feasible. And that is where I would say that libertarianism is kind of like the stopgap between, I guess, the current system that we have now and a pure anarchy. And I think that it's also the happy medium. It's one that makes more people happy. It's one that is more palatable. However, when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, the biggest issue I see with an anarchist society is that eventually you're going to get to somebody who's going to say, there are always going to be bad actors. And unless we go to extreme lengths to eliminate them when they come up, it will eventually, someone will say, no, I don't want to participate in this. I want more power. I want more stuff. I want more money. I want more control. And that's where things fall short. And and I've seen people bring up ideas, but you really have to ask, how do you mitigate that? How do you prevent that? What guardrails do you establish that can be mutually agreed upon? Again, everything comes down to mutually agreed upon parameters for this society. And I just personally don't believe that everybody's ready for it. Would I be on board for it? Absolutely. If it could work, I would be on board for that far more emphatically than I'm totally opposed to any socialist or communist society. And I've detailed the detriments, that, personal property and either the state or community ownership of different things. Like, it's basically reliant on we as a community to decide what is who has what, essentially. And it would eliminate basically a striving for success, because communism brings everybody down to the lowest common denominator. Common being the key word there. The lowest common denominator is the lazy, poor, downtrodden people that want don't want more. It's kind of like what I say. There's that sect of people who are perfectly content with collecting welfare for the rest of their lives, that they never want more. That what we've done essentially is we've made welfare too attractive. Welfare should be difficult. Welfare should be a struggle, because unless you are 100% dependent and you're unable to, you lack the ability to claw your way out of it or build yourself out of it. Basically, there are too many people on welfare, and this is kind of a broad generalization, but there are a lot of people on welfare who are perfectly content with welfare the way it is. The status quo is just fine for them. Whereas people like myself strive to improve, keep getting better. I one day want a nicer car. I one day want a bigger house. I one day want to be on a bigger piece of property. I want better things for my family. I want my kid to grow up with more opportunity and more experiences and more, and in communist and socialist society, these things don't exist anymore, because it essentially, like a lot of people kind of point to it, but the world of Star Trek is completely fantastical, just dreamland bullcrap, where we don't have money anymore. We all work to the common goal of humanity. Well, in real life, that never works, because people want nice things. People want more things. And an anarcho-capitalist society would enable that to happen. Even an anarchist society could enable that to happen. Like, if I wanted to drive a Porsche, I would work my butt off to be able to afford it. I would come up with some sort of way to produce or produce goods or services that are valuable to someone else, which is capitalism 101, to enable me to make more money to be able to afford the things that I want, the excess. But under communism, excess is gone. That's one of the big things that a lot of socialists in America are against, which, don't get me started, but the hypocrisy of people like Bernie Sanders, who owns multiple houses and claims he's a socialist, is, I think, a laughable contradiction that makes him a total hypocrite. Because, in a purely socialist society, everybody's equal. And everybody's equal in their misery in a communist, socialist, whatever society. Whereas in an anarchist society, you get the individual equality of, again, it goes back to the old American ideology that equality of opportunity is not equality of outcome. And I could do a video someday. I would love to discuss this and maybe even debate somebody on the main difference between equity and equality. Equity is wrong. Equality is right. So to kind of sum up and conclude here, that on paper, anarchism looks really attractive. However, in practice, I've yet to see a really compelling, viable outline that would take into consideration and be able to convince everyone to mutually cooperate in a voluntarist society based on an anarchist ideology. And that essentially kind of wraps it up. That while socialism is downstream, or communism is downstream from socialism, anarchism is potentially downstream of libertarianism. I think libertarianism is kind of the, while they're not synonymous, libertarianism is kind of the stopgap between authoritarianism and pure anarchy. And I think that anarchy is a solid foundational idea. I just don't think in practice it is it's viable, and I don't think it's a very really workable solution. I welcome anybody to challenge that idea, though. please, I would love to have somebody present to me a good, well-reasoned, logical argument of how it could work and why it would be preferable. But just from what I've seen, from experience, studying history, studying political theory, I just don't think it's a whole lot. I don't think it's entirely feasible, if that makes sense. So, I appreciate it. If I'm gonna wrap it up on that, I appreciate you taking time to listen today, and I welcome any constructive criticism or discussion on this, because I do feel like it is something that it's fun and interesting to explore. And so, if you like the content, like, share, subscribe, whether this is on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify. I appreciate everyone, and I hope you have a great day, and thanks again for tuning into the Freedom Factor.